At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Award-winning nature writer Wyl Menmuir has recently published his second full-length non-fiction title, The Heart of the Woods, which follows on from The Draw of the Sea, which won the coveted Roger Deakin Award from the Society of Authors. A former journalist, Wyl has written for Radio 4's Open Book, The Guardian and The Observer, and he lectures in creative writing at Falmouth University in Cornwall. I met with Wyl at the famous Ankerwycke yew tree for a chat one-to-one before we delivered a joint talk about the significance of trees and their protection to a group of UK senior heritage sector leaders. Hi Wyl, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Tom. And especially for arranging such an amazing place in which to record the podcast.
Do you mean under the flight path of Heathrow Airport?
I mean under the canopy of the Ankerwycke yew. In fact, no, I can't imagine a more iconic tree under which to record a podcast about trees. So yeah, we're doing a proper field recording here.
Yeah, and it feels a real privilege to meet with you. And you're someone that through the journey of the podcast, I have kind of kept tabs on because I've known that you were putting out a book that really was sort of mining the same themes of my podcast. So for me, that was really exciting and really grateful to have read your book. And it's absolutely played into the kind of maelstrom of ideas that I've had in bringing to the conversations I've had in the podcast. And great to sit you down now and under what is dubbed National Trust's oldest tree, the Ankerwycke yew, with so much history and spiritual association, a tree that's a real symbol for many of the themes that we touch on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking about these practical benefits as well. As we were approaching the tree, the rain came in, and the first thing we did is we ducked straight under the canopy. And so as well as being this beautiful, ancient, huge, iconic tree, it does that very practical thing of keeping us dry.
Yeah, we have got a gazebo nearby that we could have used, but we opted for this option under the boughs of the Ankerwycke yew. It's ideal. And again, I've mentioned your book, and each chapter in the book, The Heart of the Woods, is a chance to meet a couple of people that really bring to life that conversation about what trees mean to people today, actually. And do you want to tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind that one?
So the inspiration for this, I think, like so many people you talk to on the podcast, and like you said about the book being about talking to people about their different experiences of trees, it's been a real privilege listening to your podcast, in which basically you've been doing the same thing, but in audio format. And that's been accompanying me especially over the last few weeks. So thank you for that gift. I've been fascinated by trees for years. I consider myself a tree lover. I remember the trees in the garden of the house in which I grew up and having this kind of conversational relationship with them. There was an apple tree and a cherry tree. And when I came back from school, I would quite often stop by those trees, have a little chat with them, which does sound a bit weird, but then again, I was a strange child, and give them both a hug and then go inside. And that sort of continued throughout my life, that relationship with different trees. And then about 12 years ago now, my dad decided to plant a woodland in the small holding where he lives, on the boundary between England and Wales. And it was at the time when my son was born. And I've seen the woodland and my son grow up alongside each other. And every time we go and visit, we'll always walk the woods and find out what's new about them. Because Dad has this amazing relationship with that particular woodland, knowing each of those trees individually. And I realised that much as I love trees, I don't know an awful lot about them. And there were all these, I could see in this small patch of land kind of a microcosm of a conversation that was going on across the country. And that prompted me to go out and seek out people who knew more than me. So ecologists and biologists, people who maybe planted woodlands 20, 30, 50 years ago, people who have quite spiritual relationships with trees. I wanted to look at trees from all these different angles. And first and foremost, to see what I could learn about them, and then to put those into stories that I could help other people maybe get a different view of trees, that even trees that they think they know well.
Thanks. And what's normally my first question is what the trees mean to you. So simply put, what do they mean to you?
I think they mean an awful lot more to me now than before when I started. There was a wonderful woman I met up in the Highlands while I was researching the book who talked to me about the green veil. And she talked about walking into a woodland and almost seeing kind of this uniform green. It didn't really mean anything to her until she started to learn more about trees. And then she said, suddenly this green veil shifts and you've got depth and you realize it's not one green, it's hundreds of greens, thousands of greens, countless greens. And actually most of it's not green at all. And you start getting this depth of field and you develop the language to talk about it. And I think when we develop the language to talk about things, all of a sudden we're able to understand things in a different way. And so I'd say my relationship with trees, I've always loved trees, but now I feel like I'm beginning to understand what I don't even know about them. I was going to say I know more about them, but I feel like it's almost opened up a whole load of new questions that I could ask about trees.
Yeah, I can totally understand what you're talking about there. And I'm going to unashamedly sort of bring in references to your book, if you don't mind. It's quite fresh in the mind still. I've got a couple written down here I'd like to chat through with you. But one of the things that struck me was actually about a book called The Dark is Rising.
Mm.
What influence might have that played on your relationship with trees?
So The Dark is Rising, I know that a lot of people are very passionate about that book. And I know that other nature writers are. I know Robert McFarlane's a big fan. And now there's this annual read-along of the book that happens every winter, and I join in that. Unashamedly, I will reread it most years, but I remember the first time I read it. The protagonist of that book is called Wyl, so perhaps I was going to feel a natural affinity there. But I remember the scene in that book in which Wyl wakes up and it's on his birthday morning, midwinter, and he leaves the house, no one will wake up, and it's snowed, and he realizes he's slipped through some sort of veil into another world, or actually a past England, with these huge ancient forests stretching out before him. And I remember it so vividly. In my head, I was there with him. I love the idea of being able to slip through into some past that you could never see, but I also love the idea of these endless forests and the possibilities contained within them, and what that says about our relationship with woodlands and forests, and the fact that it's a memory, really. And so it struck me, I think at the time it struck me as just being an amazing thing, and I dreamt of that forest over and over and over and over again. And then as an adult, you look back and you have a different view on it. And I think there's something almost Edenic about the forest that he describes. It's like this garden that is no longer there. And we have these tiny fragments left. But there's almost something quite poignant about it, reading it as an adult. I read it with my son. It was the last book that we read together before he said, "I'm too old for you to read to me." So it was a really nice one to finish on. But I kind of hoped that he got in his head that image of this primordial forest.
Yeah, and we're sat beneath a relic of a primordial forest here.
Yeah.
The Ankerwycke, we're not quite sure of the age. Could be 900 on the bottom end, could be 2,500. But really, it's a symbol of where this landscape and many of our landscapes have come from. But more than that, it's where we came from. And I find that really fascinating, the book you've spoken about and one of the things I've been pondering is, why do children continue to be captivated by those types of ideas? And I'm going to go a little bit left field with you here, because where I've ended up is that, we are aware of how vulnerable things truly are, even if we want to pretend they're not. And we are rooted in the natural world. We're part of it. We are an animal, essentially. And yet we've constructed this kind of man-made facade, if you like, that separates us from that, at least in our minds. And yet children still have that fundamental connection, and almost feels to me like, whoa, that's kept in the psyche, because if it did all go to shit, we'd need it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've relied on trees for countless centuries, for millennia. We've had this close relationship with them for so long. And I guess this time in which we've had this idea of separation, the idea of separation from nature is quite a new thing, really. I suspect that we understand it on an intellectual level, but our bodies and our cultural memory and our genes, they don't know that. We still have this close relationship. I think we just have temporarily forgotten a bit about it as a society, as the way in which we've gone. It's that idea of us being separate. I think it's fundamentally, it's a lie. It's for me anyway, I feel that quite strongly. And so, when I see my children in the woods, a little bit like when I see them in the sea, there's a kind of lightening up, there's a freedom, there's a reckless joy about the whole thing, about them. They'll quite happily run over to a tree and throw their arms around it. And when I'm on my own, I'll do the same.
One of the pubs near to where I live is called the Green Man. And I read one of the chapters in your book about the Green Man, and actually that being kind of like a legend that speaks of that wilder world, a green giant that can lose its head and not be that bothered, basically, and how intimidating that might be to order and society. And I think there are these kind of signposts, aren't there, in our culture and our reference points, whether that's people's surnames linked to traditional practices associated with wood, like carpenter, or road names. Yeah. So what of those have stuck in your mind, having explored that kind of cultural richness?
The image of the Green Man is one that I know is important to a lot of different people, and there's a lot of controversy about it. There's a lot of people who say, well, it's definitely a medieval Christian symbol. It was developed within the church. There are lots of people who say, well, it dates back a lot further than that. But I think regardless of how you see it, the story is one that's much older. The story of the wild, what's usually a wild man of the woods, or the us before we were us, when we were closer to the trees. You see it in so many different cultures that it can't be a new thing, I think. I think we've been telling stories about ourselves and trees for millennia. So that's a fascinating thing for me. And maybe what I try to do in the book a little bit is maybe try and unpick, what are we really trying to say there? And you referenced the early medieval poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, in which the Green Knight arrives at Arthur's court and challenges these knights. They're within their stone walls. They have their civilization. They have their culture. And he challenges them to this Christmas game in which someone has to cut off his head, which is outside the bounds of what we'd normally do. It's transgressive and it's weird. And then he picks up his head once it's been chopped off and said, right, well, you, Gawain, come and find me and we will finish this game in a year's time. And I think that voyage that Gawain goes on to find the Green Man and finish this game, which he thinks is going to finish with his head being cut off, and he knows he can't pick his own head up, is one of him kind of reminding himself about the wilderness and the wildness within us. That's how I read that poem. And so I think one of the messages that might come out of that poem might be that actually we were never civilized. That wildness is still within us. It just needs to be woken up.
Thanks so much, Wyl. And I know that actually in your life as well, you've kind of undergone a sort of journey with, perhaps at different times and phases, connecting or reconnecting with the natural world outside of us. And plucking one of the kind of reference points from your book, I jotted something down, which was that spoon carving is a gateway drug when it comes to the heady world of wood carving, and bowls are like the crack cocaine. And I think that really speaks of kind of your pride in being a bodger, which some people might not know what that is. So what is it about working with wood that you connect most with?
So this could have been a book about woodlands and trees, and ignoring almost the wood itself, but it didn't feel right to me. I think to get to the heart of the woods acknowledges the fact that we've worked woodlands for centuries and millennia. So it felt natural to go into that. But as well as that, for my relationship with wood as a material goes back to, I think, the mental task of writing. Everything's in my head. I'm talking to people, I'm thinking about, I'm intellectualizing an awful lot of things. So I kind of need to balance that out with doing something with my hands, doing something that I can see the results of quite quickly. And I can carve a spoon in a couple of hours. Not necessarily a brilliant spoon. And I feel this sense of achievement at doing that. That's quite unlike the achievement of the long, slow achievement of writing a book. And it started when Valentine's Day one year, my wife bought me 2 carving knives, one straight, one hooked for the bowl of the spoon. And I sat completely absorbed making this spoon for like 3 or 4 hours. And she came into the kitchen and said, you're still there? You haven't had breakfast. You haven't got dressed. I was like, no, but I have got a spoon. I got this real buzz out of it. And so when I got the opportunity to go and join the Bodgers, or more properly, the Association of Pole Lathe Turners and Green Woodworkers, partly because I like clubs and joining clubs, and they felt like a club I wanted to be part of. And they were the most wonderful, inclusive, friendly, engaging bunch of people that I've met in a long time. And they welcomed me into their rather geeky world of spoons and pole lathe turning. You asked about bodgers and maybe said that people might not know what a bodger really is. It's kind of got these negative connotations of a job not well done, which isn't really fair on bodgers, because bodgers originally were the people who turned chair legs in the Chilterns. So actually not far from here, so High Wycombe sort of area, and they would work in the woods beneath the trees, and they'd set up camp. The idea being that it takes a lot of effort to get a trunk out of a woodland. So actually, if you fell something and work it where it is, it's a lot more efficient. And they were incredibly skilled people. So I think the term bodger is kind of undergoing a renaissance at the moment, I think, with things like the Bodgers Association getting more and more members at the moment. Because I think that on some level, it reconnects us with the material. It definitely gives me a new understanding of wood as something beautiful, wood as something that you can find these beautiful patterns and shapes within the wood. You've got to work with it. You can't work against the wood. You can't go against the grain. Otherwise it will all go wrong. And I've made all those mistakes when I've tried to do something the wood has not wanted to do, and the wood always wins. So you learn to work with the material, and that in turn then teaches me something about the world and how it works, and perhaps then feeds back into the way I relate to things like my writing.
And there's something about perseverance in there. I've made some spoons previously as well, and that kind of having to be present when you're making these things, because you are essentially reading the wood, and there are hidden knots in there that, you know, there might be some indication of on the outside of the piece, but certainly those that you didn't expect as well. And you don't know until you get to them, but then you have to then incorporate those in, and it requires a sort of mental agility and a letting go perhaps of how you might have visualized the thing turning out. You then have to adapt, and I think that speaks to a real sort of important quality at the moment, with a lot of uncertainty, but actually, yeah, just keep muddling through and it will come up with something worthwhile.
I also think that working with wood is, in a way, it's very, very simple. So there's just me and a couple of knives, and I can understand that whole thing. Whereas so much in my life, I'm reliant on products that I don't fully understand. So the phone in my pocket is far more complex than any one person can understand. I understand that it does its job most of the time, and I appreciate the job, but I think the complexity of life as it is sometimes it's almost like disenfranchising. And I feel like if I can't understand that thing, I can't connect with it in the same way, whereas I can connect with a piece of wood. It's fundamentally simple. And that kind of helps, I think. It helps with my mental balance.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it brings a lot of simplicity to things, and that can have a calming effect, really, can't it?
And I suppose also then I've got a spoon that I can use for, stirring porridge.
Yeah.
So all of our spoons at home now, all our cooking spoons and things like that are ones that I've made. So we've got this big pot. They're not meant to be hung on the wall. They're not beautiful things. They're utilitarian. They're for stirring your coffee. They're for stirring the porridge pot. They're for stirring soup. And I love seeing them being used. So I've got more spoons than I need, because once you start making them, you start making more. And so I give these spoons away, and then occasionally people get in touch with me and say, "Oh, that spoon you gave me, the coffee scoop." My brother-in-law sent me the most wonderful message, which just said, "Every time I use that scoop, it goes into my head. Wyl made that." And it's this little connection that we have through a piece of wood. And I have the same, but I swap the spoons with people for other things that they've made. So I've got a beautiful bowl made out of pittosporum that a friend on St Agnes on Scilly made for me. I gave him a spoon, he gave me the bowl, and then we occasionally will, "How's the bowl getting on? Is it still holding up?" And we have this little connection through those pieces of wood, which I think is rather lovely.
Yeah. And in terms of that kind of wood craftsmanship or craftspersonship,
yeah,
you went to Japan and really sort of immersed yourself in a culture that venerates the beauty and use of wood as a natural material, one that's no doubt in transition, like many places in the world. So perhaps it has departed from some of those traditions, but were definitely still signs that trees and timber and all that they produce and provide to us are still heavily valued there and entrenched in local vernacular and buildings, etc. What can you remember from that trip?
So much. One of the things I want to do with my books, and I think this is a fault of nature writing sometimes, is that we tend to be really inward looking, and we tend to look at things that are very, very close to us. And so because I had that feeling when I read some of the books, I wanted to make sure in each of my books I do something that very much looks outwards. And so for this book, I wanted to go to Japan, which in terms of size is fairly similar, in terms of latitude we're on a similar sort of latitude, but we've got similar-ish sorts of conditions now, yet the tree culture in Japan is completely different. I think I do quote the number in my book. I think Japan is like 70% forested as compared to here, which, is so much lower. And so I wanted to investigate a place where wood was seen quite differently. A friend of a friend happened to be the national ambassador for traditional woodwork within Japan, completely coincidentally, which was mind-blowing in itself. And he introduced me to some of the finest craftspeople working in Japan at the moment, people who make wooden steamed bento boxes for the emperor's household. And, they're fine craftspeople, people who trace their lineage back hundreds of years, in which a master passes on the skills and the approach and the tools to the apprentice over a long apprenticeship. And they take on, in turn, they take on his name. So I met people who shared the name of the first person who made these incredibly beautiful netsuke, which are like toggles for traditional Japanese robes. And they're very collectible now, quite often in the shape of animals. And he decided he wanted to use the beauty of yew, which obviously has these two very contrasting tones, in his netsuke. And he wouldn't paint them.
Sort of red and gold, aren't they?
Red and gold. So one of the one that I bought while I was there is a coin and the coin is red, and then on top of it there's a frog, and the frog is white, and there's no paint involved. This is just the contrast between those two different sorts of hue, and it's incredibly detailed and beautiful. And they wanted to share their expertise. They wanted to talk about the difficulties of acquiring these skills. So say, serving a 12-year apprenticeship in which all you do every day is copy what the master carver is doing.
With a bunch of nails in your mouth at times, is that right?
With a bunch of nails in your mouth. So one of the people I interviewed I got really into wooden roofing shingles, which sounds really dull, but actually the more I got into it, it's niche. Yeah, it is, but it's fascinating. And yeah, the first time I met this, he is a master carver himself. He's very young. I met him. He had I think 30 or 40 nails in his mouth, which he was just moving to the front of his mouth and hammering in, and in this incredibly efficient manner.
Sort of like an early nail gun in a way.
Yeah, like a mouth-driven nail gun. But you're right about it being a time of transition. I arrived almost at the point at which everything is changing, because the last set of master craftspeople haven't taken on apprentices. People don't want to do that 12-year intense apprenticeship. There's a lack of materials, there's a lack of tools. Lots of the really traditional Japanese woodwork is coated in a lacquer called urushi from the urushi tree, and because the Japanese haven't looked after their urushi trees, so there's a national lack of urushi lacquer, and so you've got this like almost perfect storm of aging woodworkers, apprentices who don't want to do the full apprenticeship. These are people who they make their own tools. So the tool becomes a kind of extension of your hand because you made it. You know exactly what that tool does. It's designed for you and your hand. And so the tools aren't being made either. You lack materials. And so lots of these traditional crafts might die out in the next 10 years. The other part of that perfect storm is that there's this declining demand for these super traditional wood items, which are seen as being quite old fashioned. But then the really exciting conversations happened late at night over many beers in these amazing restaurants, in which these young woodworkers were saying, we want to create like urushi that is neon for the young people in Tokyo. They want something quite different. There was a real buzz about that. So I left Japan with this kind of conflict of, I was really sad to see those traditional crafts in decline, but at the same time I thought there are these young people who are taking on that challenge of, well, what does it mean to us now? Japan just completely blew my mind. And talking about, like, we're sitting beneath the Ankerwycke yew, and I got to see some of these ancient trees in Japan that are held up with all of these stilts and crutches, or bound together in these really intricate ways in which they're holding the tree together in a certain way to preserve that. And so that conversation about how we look after trees, how we look after woodlands, is very much going on over there too.
Yeah, and that whole kind of continuity of management in Takayama that you mentioned as well has really helped to support the continuity of miles of forest as well, with wild boar, antelope and bears. So lots of natural processes still intact. And yet at the same time, you also speak about city forests as well, and relatively new ones, but ones that have really assumed, a really important place culturally already in Japan. And that is definitely a theme that's come up in the conversations I've had with some of my guests, is that, like, how do we integrate trees into urban landscapes, which, 90% of people in the UK live in urban places these days. And one of the other little tidbits I took from your book was about this situation in Melbourne, actually. So city trees there, and something about people emailing trees.
So it was an initiative set up in Melbourne to allow people to report on the health of the trees in the city. And so each tree was given an email address, and you could send in a report saying, oh, this tree's not looking so healthy, or this tree, there's been a car's crashed into this tree or something like that, or this tree's under threat from such and such. And what they found is that people did email these trees, but they were emailing them almost with love letters to the tree themselves. And I thought it was just such a beautiful idea that you would email your thoughts about a tree or your memory about a tree One of those sort of situations of unintended consequences being a wonderful thing. And I remember seeing it reported and thinking, that's just brilliant. I want Ancient Trees to have these email addresses that we can send in our thoughts to. Maybe we could email the Ankerwycke, I don't know.
Yeah, if only we could get its email address. And I think that's quite well hidden from what I understand.
You can get it on YouTube. No, sorry.
Oh, I love
cut
that.
Cut it.
No, that's definitely staying in. Thank you. That's absolute gold. Definitely the best joke of the series, that one, Will. Thank you. And one of the quotes that I plucked as well was that trees are touchstones. They're living symbols which are at once familiar and unknowable, mysteries with whom we share our lives, and other terms you brought into the book. And it's so rich for terminology. I really recommend anyone interested in trees to delve into it. And something about, the Roman term genius loci, and how there's a protective spirit of place associated with trees. And all of that kind of feeds into that symbolism that, we might want to send these beings a message. And that's something that's really ancient as well. So whether it's an email in Melbourne or actually on this tree that's potentially into its thousands next to me right now, that's had cluties and offerings made to it, people reaching out to trees for help, support in their lives, and that carries on.
It's so multi-layered, that relationship, the potential relationships that we have with trees. I went to see some famous clutie trees, and the fact that we will tie something on with a hope or a wish that we then hope for someone else's health to improve or something like that. Like the number of people I spoke to, whether they were sort of hard scientific, data-driven people, who you'd then say, well, what's your favourite tree? And they'd come out with this really, really quite spiritual story about a tree that they have a relationship with, and saying this, the desire that they have to just rest a hand against this particular tree. And it is quite often with ancient trees or trees of a certain size. The way I conceive of it is they have this kind of gravitational pull. And so trees like, the tree under which we're sitting at the moment, there's something about the age and the size that draws us towards it. And I think when you can see it when people approach the tree, there's quite often an air of reverence about it. There's an air of, this tree has a life that's so completely different to mine, that stretches potentially, back 2,000, 2,500 years. The idea that we're living on different timescales, but we're sharing this space right now. It's really special. And I do think that that's one of the reasons why we then attach stories to trees. Like trees are like these magnets that pull story towards them. So we attach the story that potentially the Magna Carta was signed beneath this very tree. Potentially this is the tree under which Henry VIII had these assignations with Anne Boleyn, even though probably these things didn't really happen, but the tree itself kind of draws those stories to it. They're like these living connections to these pasts that are unknowable. And so the tree is full of these unknowable things that we kind of sense, if that's not getting too sort of spiritual about it.
Not at all. And actually, one of the other questions I've been bringing to the forefront of my mind is, what does indigenous culture mean in our country, where we live in the UK? And your book helps to delve into some of that as well. So, things like Celtic traditions, which are still held in some parts of the UK, and Druids, so the sort of watchers of the trees, really, and even things like the Celtic Ogham alphabet as well, which each had a tree trunk symbol for each letter.
Yeah.
And that wasn't that long ago, really, that these things were really ingrained.
Well, not in tree life. It's not that long ago. Yeah, I think we are essentially tree people. We are people of the trees, and it's embedded in things, in words like druid, which the etymology of which is basically oak knower. I think actually I'd almost rather know them as oak knowers, because it kind of suggests this relationship with the trees that was deep, and you knew the parts of the tree, you knew the uses of the tree, you knew the benefits of spending time around those trees. More recently, in sort of the last 150, 200 years, maybe maybe a little bit longer than that, we've sort of started to move away from that. I suspect it wouldn't take much to sort of twist that and remind us that we are tree people, purely because I've not yet met anyone who says, oh, I hate trees. Maybe it's the people I'm talking to just really like trees, but quite often there is a connection there. There's a connection with beauty, or with function, or with form, or with a particular sort of tree. And I think those associations run really deep.
Yeah. And if I ever find the person that doesn't like trees, I'd really like to talk to them on the podcast. So I've got a long list of people I'd love to speak to. Some don't yet exist, but they're ideas. But that's definitely one. Is I'd like to speak to people that genuinely feel nothing about trees and understand that, to get the flip side. Speaking about kind of access and the immediacy of that to the natural world, ideologically, there are barriers today that prevent us from maintaining that relationship. And I know one of the bits of your book was about a kind of planned trespass.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling us a bit about that? So why did you want to do that, and what did you learn from that experience?
I learned an awful lot from it. So growing up, I didn't have a great respect for boundaries. And so I would hop over fences into farmers' fields as a child, and it never really bothered me. And I mean, apart from, when you had someone wave a shotgun at you, or, set dogs on you, which happened several times. And I'd never really questioned that relationship. And then I realized that actually I thought that my mindset is quite free and open, boundaryless. But actually the number of times that I do pay attention to the keep out signs and things like that, I realized that kind of these boundaries are stories that we tell ourselves, and they're quite powerful stories. They go back a long way. And so when I got this opportunity to go on a planned trespass, which was actually supposed to be just a walk with the author, Guy Shrubsole, he writes about land access, and he wrote that wonderful book, The Lost Rainforests of Great Britain. And he said, let's go on a walk, and we'll go and trespass, because one of the things I want to do is gather a bit of data about pheasant releases from this particular estate, because we suspect that this person is releasing pheasants into a triple SI woodland on Dartmoor. And then he phoned me up a couple of days before, and he said, oh, I've got a couple of friends who want to come. Is it okay if, some people join us? And when we met in this village square, there were like 20 or 30 people, and they brought kids, and people had bought lunch boxes, and we went on this just brilliant trespass. And one of the things he said is, we never meet the landowner. It will be very, very tame, and I'm not sure what you're going to get out of this. And of course, we met the landowner, and we had this encounter with him, and they'd prepared very carefully. They weren't confrontational. They wanted to talk about land access, and they wanted to engage him in this conversation. But as this was happening, because we decided that as a group, we wouldn't all approach him, because that would be confrontational. So we had one spokesperson who would talk to the landowner, so he didn't feel threatened by us. So we all sat with our flapjacks and our tea. And the people I was speaking to weren't the landowner, it was the other people there. And they were all saying the same thing, is we're law-abiding people. We don't break laws in our lives, but we've decided to do this because we want to challenge notions of where we belong and where we're kept out of. There was a woman who was sitting next to me who said, I feel really uncomfortable about this. Even though no one's shouting, but she said, I still feel like I'm in the wrong place and I shouldn't be here. But there's a bit in my head which says, and you need to sit with that. You need to sit with that experience and explore it, because it's a story that you're telling yourself. And it only really struck home later when I was up in the Highlands, and I decided to do a walk between two glens and not use the road. Where in Scotland, you have this right to roam. And I was walking through people's land. At one point, I walked around the back of someone's house, staying as far away from it as I could. But still, in the back of my head, I was like, oh, what happens when someone sets the dogs on me? And I was like, oh, that's not going to happen here, because this is allowed here. And it's like the story here is different to the story there, and we're only a couple of 100 miles away. And so it interests me, the stories we tell about ourselves, about where we belong, where we don't belong. I'd like to see something more like the Scottish system.
Yeah, I think as I see it, generally there is a need for access and freedom around access to the natural world.
Yeah.
And that goes hand in hand, though, with a kind of respect for what is there and allowing it to do its thing, ultimately, beyond our own needs, really, and a sacredness as well. And yeah, not necessarily an entitlement to visit every tree and place all the time.
Yeah. And I think I like that you brought up sacredness. I think that we could do with more of a dose of that. I think our best relationships with trees quite often come from respecting them as sacred beings, which again, I'm kind of getting spiritual again, but the more I saw people respecting trees in that way, the more I thought, well, okay, that's got to have a knock-on effect with your other behaviours, with the way in which you relate to the natural world more generally. And I think we have to shift more in that direction. So if there's something I want out of people reading this particular book, is perhaps to get more of a sense of that sacred, perhaps, even if that comes about through a scientific understanding of a tree. Because I think I saw it as much talking to scientists and mycologists as I did talking to people who do forest bathing.
So, Will, it's been great to geek out on tree stuff with you. And I've got a little test for you. If you're up for getting into this. So you even have a glossary in your book about some of those terms that you've come across. And don't worry, you don't have to get a full score, but I'm wondering, there's a few I wrote down. I'm going to say the word and you've got to try and give me a really pithy definition for those.
God, okay.
All right. So let's start with, and I might pronounce these the wrong way, so you can have to correct me, but yeah, southering.
Southering, if I remember it correctly, is the term that John Clare, the poet, coined for the sound of wind in the leaves. Is that right?
That's absolutely spot on.
Okay.
What about treen? That was a new one for me.
Treen are the products of green woodworking, so bowls and spoons and other things that you can make, usually using a pole lathe or a knife or some sort of gouge, usually made by hand, and they're made by bodgers.
Okay, and this next one I could definitely make a real hash of, but I'm going to do my best. So, Valdine Samkate.
Valdine Samkate. Is, I think, if I remember rightly, it's forest fear. It's the German term for forest fear, one of these wonderful compound nouns, that the feeling that you get when you're in the woods alone and you feel this inexplicable fear of the wild.
Brilliant. You nailed it. How about Zanu then? Or Zanu?
Zanu, the Japanese term. Oh, crikey. That one's completely gone out.
That's all right. That's all right.
I think Zanu's to do with. Is Zanu one of the winds?
It's actually the last cherry blossom petal.
Yes. So this, I can't believe I forgot that. It's the very, very Japanese idea of a fleeting moment, and it's the last petal that drops, and it's kind of a moment that's there and then gone. Zanu is used quite a lot in traditional haiku. It's not a word that you would use in everyday conversation, as far as I understand, but it's useful to describe this very, very fleeting moment that's very important in kind of Buddhist philosophy as well. Is it's a tiny moment.
And sticking with Japan, how about Myoto Kusu?
Myoto Kusu are the marriage trees. The marriage trees in the forest temple in the middle of Tokyo. Two camphor trees that grew very close to one another, and they're a temple in their own right. And people go and pray to these particular trees. And I went to see these trees, and they actually reminded me more of the way in which love is described in Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, as something like two trees that grow side by side but separate, and their branches touch. And I just really, it's a beautiful image of what love is like at its best. And I thought these camphor trees kind of they embody that for me. And they're special for people across Japan. They kind of have that iconic status that the Ankerwycke tree has.
One of the other ones is crown shyness, which is kind of similar to what you described there as, the branch tips just giving each other that little bit of space where trees do exist next to each other.
There's the photograph of crown shyness from that sacred forest in the middle of Tokyo in the book, because I'd just come from, I can't remember, there's a crossing in Tokyo at which millions of people cross every day, and I'd crossed this crossing with, I think, 45,000 other people cross every time that people cross. It was insane. And then just a mile from there's this sacred forest, and I walked through these symbolic gates, these torii gates, and the sound of the city completely disappeared. And all of a sudden, all I could hear was wind in the leaves and birds in the trees. I was like, have I just stepped through this portal into a completely different world? And I looked up and I could see the trees had given each other space between the branches, and it almost looks like rivers and tributaries when you see it marked out like that, and kind of like you're looking up or you're looking down on like something like the Amazon. It's beautiful to see. But it's this tendency of trees to avoid each other too much.
No, I think you absolutely passed the quiz with flying colours. There were bonus marks. I didn't tell you about that, but you got all of those. And
how many points did I get? That's the important question.
Good question. No, I'm going to keep a tree shyness about that.
Okay,
one.
Fine.
So I'm going to round off now by just saying, again, thanks for your book. It's awesome. And it's time to hand over to you to leave our listeners with a final message.
Final message. Spend more time with trees. Spend more time around them, with them, learning about them, thinking about them, getting other people's views on them, and seeing that actually a tree isn't one thing. A tree is a different thing to each different person who encounters that. And I think I can only think it's a good thing to learn more about the ways that other people experience trees in order to enrich our own understanding, in order to enrich their understanding, and perhaps come to some sort of negotiation of how we best protect them and how we best encounter them and how we best continue to live alongside them. Yeah, that's my message.
Been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.